In the winter of 1492, as the first light of dawn crept across the snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the last Muslim kingdom in Europe stood on the edge of annihilation. From the walls of Granada, defenders could see the smoke rising from the Christian camp of Santa Fe, a permanent settlement that proclaimed one terrifying truth. The Catholics were not leaving until the city surrendered. This was no ordinary siege. This was the final act of a drama that had unfolded across 8 centuries, the death knell of a civilization that had once ruled from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar. But how had it come to this? How had the heirs of Córdoba, the builders of the Alhambra, the masters of al-Andalus, been reduced to defending a single city against the combined might of Castile and Aragon? The answer lies in betrayal, civil war, and the ruthless ambition of 2 monarchs who would stop at nothing to complete the Reconquista. What you're about to witness is not just the fall of Granada. It's the systematic destruction of 700 years of Moorish Spain, orchestrated by Ferdinand and Isabella with a precision that would reshape the world forever. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back to 1238, when Muhammad ibn Nasr established the Nasrid dynasty in Granada. For over 2 centuries, this kingdom had survived by playing a dangerous game, paying tribute to Christian rulers while maintaining its independence. The Nasrids built the magnificent Alhambra, created poetry that still moves hearts today, and preserved the last flame of Islamic learning in Western Europe. They were survivors, diplomats, artists and warriors all at once. Yet by 1482, the kingdom that had endured for nearly 250 years was tearing itself apart from within. The aging Sultan Abu al-Hasan Ali faced a rebellion from his own son, Muhammad XII, known to the Christians as Boabdil. This was no ordinary family dispute. It was a civil war that would hand Ferdinand and Isabella the keys to Granada on a silver platter. The spark that ignited this internal conflict came from an unlikely source. Abu al-Hasan Ali had grown tired of paying tribute to the Catholic monarchs. In 1481, when Castilian envoys arrived demanding the annual payment, the old sultan reportedly declared that the mints of Granada no longer coined gold, but steel. It was a defiant gesture that would cost his kingdom everything. Ferdinand and Isabella seized upon this refusal as the perfect excuse to launch what they called the Granada War. But they were not content with mere conquest. They wanted total victory, complete submission, and the absolute end of Islamic rule in Iberia. Their campaign would be methodical, relentless, and devastating in its efficiency. The Catholic monarchs brought innovations that the Muslims had never faced before. Artillery became their weapon of choice, massive bombards that could reduce ancient walls to rubble in days rather than months. Towns that might have withstood traditional sieges for years fell to cannon fire in weeks. The Christians had learned the lessons of gunpowder warfare, while Granada remained trapped in medieval tactics. Meanwhile, within Granada itself, the civil war between father and son was reaching its climax. Boabdil, backed by the powerful Abencerrages family, seized the Alhambra in 1482 and declared himself sultan. Abu al-Hasan Ali retreated to Málaga, splitting the kingdom's already limited resources between 2 rival courts. The timing could not have been worse. Ferdinand, ever the opportunist, watched this family drama unfold with calculating eyes. When Boabdil launched his first military campaign against the Christians in 1483, Ferdinand was ready. At the Battle of Lucena, Boabdil's forces were crushed, and the young pretender himself was taken prisoner. But instead of executing him or demanding an impossible ransom, Ferdinand made a decision that would echo through history. In the fortress where Boabdil was held captive, Ferdinand presented him with a choice that was no choice at all: convert to Christianity and become an ally, or watch his kingdom burn while he rotted in a dungeon. The exact details of Boabdil's conversion remain shrouded in mystery, but when he emerged from captivity, he had signed the Pact of Córdoba. This document turned him into Ferdinand's most valuable weapon against his own people. Under the terms of this pact, Boabdil agreed to help the Christians capture the territories controlled by his uncle, Muhammad al-Zaghal, who had seized power after Abu al-Hasan Ali's death in 1485. In exchange, Ferdinand would support Boabdil's claim to the throne and allow him to rule the remaining territories as a Christian vassal. It was a masterpiece of divide and conquer, turning the Nasrids against each other while the Christians picked off their cities one by one. Al-Zaghal, known as the Valiant, proved to be a far more capable military leader than either his brother or his nephew. He organized the defense of eastern Granada with skill and determination, inflicting several defeats on Christian forces. But he was fighting a war on multiple fronts, facing not only Ferdinand's armies, but also the forces of his own nephew, now backed by Christian gold and Christian steel. The tragedy of Granada's final decade was not just military defeat, but the complete breakdown of unity in the face of existential threat. While Christian armies methodically captured Muslim strongholds, the defenders spent their strength fighting each other. Cities that could have held out for months fell within days because their garrisons were divided between rival claimants to the throne. Ferdinand's strategy was as psychological as it was military. By supporting Boabdil, he ensured that every Christian victory looked like a Muslim betrayal. When Málaga fell after a brutal siege in 1487, its defenders knew they had been abandoned by their own supposed sultan. When Baza surrendered in 1489, it was Boabdil's envoys who negotiated the terms. The moral authority of the Nasrid dynasty crumbled with each passing year. Isabella, meanwhile, turned the Granada War into a holy crusade. She traveled to the front lines herself, blessing cannons, distributing communion to soldiers, and transforming what might have been a simple territorial conquest into a sacred mission. The Christian armies were not just fighting for land, they were fighting for the soul of Spain itself. The Queen's presence on the battlefield had an electric effect on Christian morale. Here was the woman who had united Castile and Aragon through her marriage to Ferdinand, who had reformed the church, who had expelled Jews from her kingdoms. Now she stood before the walls of Muslim cities, promising paradise to those who died in battle and eternal glory to those who lived to see victory. By 1490, al-Zaghal's resistance had finally crumbled. Facing overwhelming odds and betrayal from within his own ranks, he agreed to surrender his remaining territories in exchange for safe passage to North Africa. His departure left Boabdil as the sole ruler of what remained of Granada, a pitiful remnant consisting of little more than the capital city and the Alpujarras Mountains. It was then that Boabdil made his final desperate gamble. Despite years of collaboration with the Christians, despite the pact that had kept him on the throne, he broke his vassalage and declared his independence. Perhaps he finally understood that Ferdinand and Isabella would never be satisfied with a puppet Muslim ruler. Perhaps the weight of his people's hatred had finally become unbearable. Or perhaps he simply chose to die as a sultan rather than live as a traitor. The decision sealed Granada's fate. Ferdinand and Isabella had been planning for this moment, assembling the largest army in Spanish history for what they knew would be the final campaign. In April 1491, as spring flowers bloomed across Andalusia, the last act of the Reconquista was about to begin. The army that assembled outside Granada in the spring of 1491 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. 80,000 men converged on the fertile plains surrounding the city, their banners stretching from horizon to horizon. This was not merely the combined forces of Castile and Aragon, it was the embodiment of Christian Europe's centuries-long dream of reconquest. Knights in gleaming armor rode alongside Genoese crossbowmen, Swiss pikemen marched beside Andalusian militias, and at the heart of it all, the great bombards rolled forward on their massive wooden carriages, promising destruction to any who dared resist. Ferdinand had learned the lessons of every siege in the 10-year war. No longer would his forces retreat to winter quarters, allowing the defenders time to resupply and rebuild their morale. This time, the Christians would stay until the end. The message was clear: Granada would surrender, or Granada would starve. The sight that greeted the defenders on the walls was enough to break the spirit of even the bravest warrior. As far as the eye could see, Christian tents covered the landscape like a vast white sea. Smoke rose from countless cooking fires. The sound of hammering echoed across the valley as engineers constructed siege engines, and through it all, the steady rhythm of marching feet as fresh reinforcements arrived daily from across the peninsula. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated Ferdinand's genius for psychological warfare. Instead of launching an immediate assault, he ordered his men to begin construction of a permanent settlement. Day by day, the Muslim defenders watched in horror as their enemies built not a camp, but a city. Streets were laid out in perfect grid patterns, stone foundations were dug, and wooden buildings began to rise. The Christians were literally building their future on Granada's doorstep. Within weeks, this settlement had grown into a fully functioning town, complete with markets, churches, and administrative buildings. Ferdinand christened it Santa Fe, Holy Faith, a name that proclaimed the sacred nature of his mission. From the walls of Granada, Boabdil's soldiers could see Christian families moving into permanent homes, children playing in the streets, merchants conducting business as if this were any normal Spanish town. The psychological impact was devastating. The defenders found themselves staring not at a besieging army, but at a glimpse of their own future. This was what Granada would become once the walls fell, a Christian city where Arabic would be forgotten and the call to prayer would be replaced by church bells. Santa Fe was both promise and threat, showing Muslims what awaited them if they surrendered peacefully, and what would be built over their graves if they chose to resist. Inside Granada, the situation grew more desperate with each passing day. The city that had once been home to perhaps 200,000 souls now groaned under the weight of refugees from across the kingdom. Every village and town that had fallen to Christian armies had sent its surviving population fleeing to the capital. The streets overflowed with families who had lost everything, their possessions reduced to whatever they could carry on their backs. Food became scarce, then precious, then almost impossible to find. The Christians controlled every road, every mountain pass, every route by which supplies might enter the city. What little grain remained in the royal warehouses was carefully rationed, but even the most optimistic calculations showed it would not last through the summer. Mothers watched their children grow thin, merchants saw their shops empty one by one, and still the white tents of Santa Fe stretched endlessly across the horizon. Boabdil found himself trapped between impossible choices. His advisors whispered constantly in his ear, some urging surrender while others demanded a fight to the death. The Abencerrages family, who had helped place him on the throne, now split into factions arguing over whether to negotiate with the Christians or flee to North Africa. Trust became a luxury the city could not afford, as rumors of treachery spread through the narrow streets like plague. The young sultan sent desperate messages to every Muslim power he could reach. Letters flew to the Ottoman Empire, begging for ships and soldiers. Envoys traveled to North Africa, pleading for grain and gold. Messengers rode to Egypt, invoking the bonds of Islamic Brotherhood. But no help came. The Ottoman sultans were locked in their own wars. The rulers of North Africa faced their own crises, and Egypt's Mamluks could spare nothing for a distant kingdom they had never truly considered part of their world. Each rejection was another nail in Granada's coffin. The defenders began to understand that they stood alone, the last defenders of a dream that the rest of the Islamic world had already abandoned. Al-Andalus, once the jewel of Muslim Spain, had shrunk to a single city surrounded by enemies who grew stronger with every passing day. Ferdinand, meanwhile, demonstrated the patience of a master strategist. He knew that time was his greatest weapon, more deadly than any cannon or catapult. Every day that passed weakened Granada's resolve while strengthening his own position. Fresh supplies arrived regularly from across Spain, new recruits swelled his ranks, and the great engines of war were positioned with mathematical precision around the city's walls. The Catholic monarchs had also learned to exploit the deep divisions within Granada itself. Gold flowed like water into the pockets of Muslim officials, willing to provide information about the city's defenses, its food supplies, its morale. Some betrayals were small, a guard who left a gate unbarred, a merchant who revealed the location of hidden grain stores. Others were spectacular acts of treason that opened entire sections of the walls to Christian assault. Isabella herself arrived in Santa Fe during the autumn of 1491, her presence transforming the siege from a military operation into a religious crusade. She established her court in the new city, hearing petitions, dispensing justice, and demonstrating to the world that Christian rule had already replaced Muslim authority in this corner of Spain. Her daily prayers were offered in full view of Granada's walls, a constant reminder to the defenders of the faith that would soon claim their city. The Queen's arrival coincided with a series of increasingly desperate sorties by the Muslim garrison. Night after night, small groups of warriors crept from the city gates, hoping to destroy Christian siege engines or capture supplies. These raids achieved little beyond adding to the growing pile of Muslim dead in the no-man's land between the armies. Each failed attack weakened Granada's already stretched defenses and provided Ferdinand with fresh intelligence about the city's remaining strength. As winter approached, even the most optimistic defenders began to accept the inevitable. The walls that had protected Granada for centuries could not protect it from starvation. The wells that had never run dry could not fill empty stomachs. The faith that had sustained the kingdom through 2.5 centuries of struggle was being tested beyond endurance. In the narrow alleys of the Albaycin, families gathered around dying fires and spoke in whispers of surrender. In the palaces of the Alhambra, courtiers who had once composed poetry about eternal Muslim rule now drafted letters of submission. Even in the mosques, where imams had preached holy war just months before, prayers increasingly focused on divine mercy rather than divine victory. Boabdil himself seemed to age years in the space of months. The young man who had once dreamed of restoring his kingdom's former glory now spent his days staring from the Torre de Comares across the valley towards Santa Fe, watching the smoke rise from Christian hearths. His mother, Aixa, the woman who had helped orchestrate his rise to power, now pressed him daily to consider terms of surrender before the city's suffering became unbearable. The end was approaching with the inexorable certainty of winter's chill. In the Christian camp, preparations began for the final ceremonies of conquest. In the Muslim city, a civilization prepared to breathe its last. November brought the first serious negotiations. Secret emissaries slipped through the darkness between Granada's walls and Santa Fe, carrying messages that would determine the fate of thousands. Boabdil's representatives, exhausted men who had watched their world crumble stone by stone, sat across from Ferdinand's diplomats in torchlit chambers. The terms they discussed were not those of equals, but of conqueror and conquered. Ferdinand's initial demands were harsh, but not unreasonable by the standards of medieval warfare. Complete surrender of the city and all its territories, recognition of Christian sovereignty over all former Muslim lands, payment of tribute for past rebellions. Yet as the talks progressed, something unexpected emerged from the negotiations. The Catholic monarchs, perhaps recognizing the delicate nature of ruling a Muslim population, began to offer terms that seemed almost generous. The proposed treaty granted extraordinary concessions to Granada's Muslim inhabitants. They could keep their property, practice their religion, and maintain their customs under Christian rule. Local magistrates would be elected from among the Muslim population. Arabic could continue to be spoken and written. No one would be forced to convert to Christianity. Those who wished to emigrate to North Africa would be given safe passage and time to sell their possessions. These terms spread through Granada like wildfire, creating fierce debates in every corner of the city. Some saw them as a miracle, a chance to preserve their way of life under new rulers. Others viewed them with deep suspicion, wondering how long Christian promises would last once the gates were opened. The memory of broken treaties and forgotten oaths haunted every discussion. Boabdil found himself caught between the desperate hopes of his people and the cold reality of his situation. His military commanders urged him to reject any terms that did not guarantee genuine autonomy. Religious leaders demanded assurances that mosques would remain open and Islamic law would be respected. Common citizens simply wanted to know if their children would be safe under Christian rule. The young sultan's inner circle had been decimated by years of war and suspicion. Those advisors who remained were divided into irreconcilable factions. Some, led by his mother Aixa, pushed for immediate acceptance of Ferdinand's terms, arguing that further resistance would only lead to harsher conditions. Others, including several military leaders, insisted that surrender meant the death of everything they had fought to preserve. As December arrived, bringing bitter cold to the mountains surrounding Granada, the negotiations took on an air of inevitability. Boabdil's representatives returned again and again to Santa Fe, each time with fewer bargaining chips and more desperate pleas. Ferdinand, sensing victory, began to soften some of his demands while making others non-negotiable. The process resembled a master chess player offering his opponent a choice between quick defeat and slow strangulation. The breakthrough came when Isabella herself entered the discussions. The Queen, whose presence had transformed the siege into a holy war, now became the voice of unexpected mercy. She proposed additional guarantees for Muslim religious practices and promised that her personal protection would extend to all who accepted Christian rule peacefully. Her words carried the weight of royal oath, something that even Granada's most suspicious defenders found difficult to dismiss. On November 25, 1491, in a ceremony attended by representatives from both sides, the Treaty of Granada was signed. The document, written in both Arabic and Latin, represented the formal surrender of the last Muslim kingdom in Western Europe. Yet the treaty also granted a 2-month grace period, allowing time for final preparations and giving Boabdil's subjects a chance to accept the new reality. The terms of the treaty spread through Granada with mixed reactions. Relief was the most common emotion, as families who had spent months preparing for death began to imagine survival. Markets that had been empty for weeks suddenly buzzed with activity as people emerged from their homes to discuss the future. Children played in the streets for the first time since the siege began, their laughter echoing off walls that would soon hear Christian prayers. But beneath the surface relief, deeper currents of grief and anger flowed through the city. In the Alhambra's ornate chambers, courtiers packed precious manuscripts and artwork, trying to preserve what they could of their cultural heritage. Scholars debated whether to remain and risk seeing their life's work destroyed, or flee to uncertain exile in North Africa. Poets composed final verses about the glory that was ending and the darkness that lay ahead. The 2-month waiting period created a strange atmosphere of suspended animation. Christian merchants began appearing in Granada's markets, selling goods and establishing trade relationships for the future. Muslim families held long discussions about whether to stay or leave, weighing love of homeland against fear of persecution. The city existed in a twilight state, neither fully Muslim nor Christian, neither at war nor at peace. Ferdinand used this time to make final preparations for the transfer of power. Christian administrators were briefed on local customs and laws. Clergy were instructed on the treaty's religious provisions. Military commanders planned the occupation with careful attention to avoiding incidents that might spark resistance. Every detail was orchestrated to ensure that the transition would be as smooth as possible. Isabella, meanwhile, focused on the symbolic aspects of the conquest. She commissioned artists to design banners that would fly over the Alhambra, selected the hymns that would be sung at the victory celebration, and chose the biblical passages that would be read to mark the completion of the Reconquista. For her, Granada's fall represented not just military triumph, but divine vindication of her life's work. As the new year approached, both sides began the delicate process of implementing the treaty. Christian officials toured the city to familiarize themselves with its layout and population. Muslim leaders compiled lists of properties and religious sites that would need protection under the new regime. Interpreters worked frantically to translate legal documents and administrative records from Arabic to Latin. The final days of December brought a series of farewell ceremonies that were both celebration and funeral. Families gathered in mosques for what they knew might be their last communal prayers under Muslim rule. Merchants closed shops that had operated for generations, uncertain whether they would reopen under Christian management. Students at Granada's ancient schools packed their books, unsure if Islamic learning would have a place in the new order. Boabdil himself seemed to withdraw from public life during these final weeks. The young man who had once dreamed of rivaling the great sultans of Córdoba now spent his days in the gardens of the Alhambra, walking among fountains that would soon echo with foreign voices. His mother Exa, ever practical, supervised the packing of the royal treasury and the preparation of documents that would ensure their safe passage to exile. On the last night of 1491, Granada held its breath. Tomorrow would bring the end of everything that had defined the city for nearly 8 centuries. The call to prayer echoed across the rooftops one final time under Muslim rule, a haunting melody that seemed to carry the weight of accumulated centuries. In the darkness, families said prayers for the dead, for the living, and for the uncertain future that awaited them all. The morning of January 2nd, 1492, dawned clear and cold. From the walls of Granada, the defenders could see Christian banners being prepared for the victory parade. In Santa Fe, trumpets sounded the assembly as Ferdinand and Isabella prepared for their moment of ultimate triumph. The stage was set for the final act of a drama that had begun with the Muslim conquest of 711. As the sun climbed higher in the winter sky, the gates of Granada slowly opened. The last chapter of Muslim Spain was about to end, not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet ceremony of surrender. 8 centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia would conclude in a few hours of formal ritual, marking the completion of the Reconquista and the birth of a Spain that would soon reshape the world. And so, on that cold January morning in 1492, as Boabdil handed Ferdinand the keys to Granada, and legend claims he shed his last tear for what he could not defend, more than a city fell. 7 centuries of Islamic civilization in Europe breathed its final breath. The Reconquista was complete, but this was merely the beginning. With Granada's gold filling their coffers and no more Muslim kingdoms to conquer, Ferdinand and Isabella would turn their gaze westward, funding a Genoese navigator named Columbus who waited in their court. The fall of Granada didn't just end the Middle Ages in Spain. It launched the age of global empire, forever changing the world.